Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I am here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host who may never come back to the United States, Mr. Tim O'Toole. Tim, how are you?
What's going on, Brian? Hello from Canada.
Yes,
Finally.
for anybody watching on YouTube, you can probably gather that Tim is in Canada by his attire. But for any of y'all listening on on the traditional podcast means Tim is decked out in his full Canadiens gear and is celebrating the fact that he's finally been able to cross the border and get up to Montreal, or to the Montreal area rather.
Where does a balmy 58 degrees?
I wish it was 58 degrees in DC. That would be amazing. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us. Welcome to Embargoed. Welcome back to Embargoed. We have largely taken the month of August off, a much needed rest, both for Tim and I. Not entirely idle, unfortunately, but away from podcasting, at least for the better part of the month. But we are back, and we're recording this on August 31st. This will go up the first couple days of September. And we're very happy to be back. Thank you for everybody for that we've heard from in the intervening few weeks when we've been off the air. But we have a special episode coming back to take us out of our summer break. And we have a guest who we will introduce in just a moment. And we're really only doing the roadmap for today is pretty simple. We're going to have our guest on to discuss some topics that I will get to in a moment relating to enforcement, both on the OFAC side and the BIS side. And then after we say goodbye to our guest, Tim and I are going to spend the last remaining portion of the show talking about what is probably the unquestioned number one international story at the moment, certainly as relates to the U.S., which is Afghanistan. And we're going to talk about what's happened in the past few weeks and where things stand now and what we expect, especially on the sanctions front, which I think is a big, huge question mark that everybody's asking at the moment. So before we jump in, just our normal reminders: we're not giving legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information. Everything you hear is the opinion of me or Tim or our guest, Michael. So if you don't like them, blame us. Don't blame anybody else. And if you enjoy the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your pod content. Please leave us a review, hopefully a 5-star review, and spread the word. We will be back to pretty much our normal schedule every 2 weeks going forward. And this is going to take us out of the summer and into the fall. Before we get started, Tim, any thoughts, as you are in a much nicer venue today podcasting than either Michael or I are? Any thoughts that you'd like to share, perspective, reflections?
Yeah, I mean, kind of getting out of the thick of things. I still am struck by how much sanctions activity and export controls activity is going on in August. Not just for you and me in terms of active matters, but also just what's going on with OFAC. It does seem like they've got their hands full in a number of different areas. We'll talk about one of them after we talk to Michael.
Yeah,
it's way more active than I remember.
Yeah, some Augusts are pretty quiet. Some Augusts end up being kind of a dumping ground or parking lot where a lot of things just kind of get released because people have time to finally focus on those things or get them wrapped up. I think there is a lot we are not covering today. And that's intentional. We're going to come back to a lot of these things the next time around. There've been new executive orders, new sanctions actions, new enforcement actions, many things that have happened in the last several weeks that we are purposefully skipping for the moment. We are just going to talk to our guest and talk Afghanistan, and then next time around we're going to catch up on some of those things.
Well, this was, Michael's articles were timely and important and are really, I think, a good topic to spend half hour talking about, because this is the big enforcement actions in the area in the last 5 or 10 years. So that's great.
Indeed. So with that, I think that's a good segue to introduce our guests. So we are happy to have with us today Michael Griffiths from Global Investigations Review, GIR. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Hi, Brian and Tim. Thanks for having me on.
We're very pleased to have Michael on with us today, and he's somebody we've known for a while. We talk to occasionally, including for these articles. But what prompted us to ask Michael to join us is, and for anybody out there who listens to this podcast who does not subscribe to the GIR Just Sanctions publication, shame on you. You should remedy that immediately, and you should
Exactly.
sign up immediately. And so in August, for those who didn't see this, Michael published two pieces, which were surveys of practitioners in the sanctions and export controls area. And basically, the question that he posed to everyone was, can you share with me what you think the most important or essential or consequential, meaningful enforcement actions have been that have shaped OFAC compliance, sanctions compliance, and export controls compliance over the past few years? And so a really interesting premise and interesting question. And so and for those who haven't seen those articles, fully encourage you to go check them out, but we're obviously going to talk a bit more about that. So let's just start with Michael. In terms of, what kind of drove you to look into this and to kind of, take a survey of folks who think about these things all the time, like Tim and I do. Kind of what prompted you to do that, and then, maybe as a first question, just initial reaction, kind of what were your sort of most interesting takeaways from what you learned by going through this exercise?
Yeah, so the genesis of it was that every so often, as I've done to you both, as you alluded to earlier, I have a chat to lawyers about around the sanctions field. Sometimes as a journalist, you want to find out what people know a lot of the time. Other times you want to find out what they would like to know. So I was having a casual conversation with a prominent lawyer in the DC area, Kerry Contini at Baker McKenzie, and she said that what she would really like to know is what were the sort of enforcement actions that lawyers' clients sort of picked up the phone and said, oh, we didn't know this was the case, and then we had to institute a whole range of measures to sort of address that. So from that germ of the idea, we're really looking for, both with OFAC enforcement actions and with BIS enforcement actions, really trying to get an idea of which enforcement actions really had the greatest influence on corporate compliance. For me, as you both know, I started covering this field in about February 2019 full-time. We had sort of done sanctions things before at GIR, but really our focus started ramping up in about 2019. And so while you try and learn the beat a bit, there is a sort of institutional knowledge that begins when you start doing it full time. And so my world is sort of oriented by the ELF cosmetics enforcement actions, which I feel is when my knowledge begins. But anyway, so it was a very simple thing. So I think I contacted a fair few firms, and I got 12 responded, and it was pretty free. Pretty free and easy, that anyone who wanted to contribute could contribute, and that's fine. So for the OFAC survey, we got about 30 lawyers responding, and for the BIS survey, we got a bit fewer than that, which we can get into why later on. But I suppose the main takeaways for the OFAC one is that by far and away the most voted for enforcement action was the CSE Transtel case from 2017. Which I don't know if you want to disclose, but voted for as well by you two. So and then we had the ExxonMobil case, and then we had the ELF Cosmetics case. But I suppose one of they were the top three, and the sort of clear top three. But I think what I found particularly interesting was that in the OFAC survey, we had 18 different enforcement actions referenced, which I really wasn't expecting. I was genuinely expecting to get the ELF Cosmetics case, and that was it. And then some other ones. But yeah, so it was really interesting. There was a really even spread. I think I'm not sure if you want to sort of get into more detail about that.
Yeah, now. I was going to say one of the things that occurs, I think, as you alluded to, I think those were our top three as well, and maybe the order was slightly different, but I think those were sort of our top three as well. One of the things that I think is striking to me and that Tim and I talk about all the time is, as you said, there was a wide range of cases and enforcement actions that kind of made the list. And I think they're, for different reasons. Some might be because people see an industry focus. Some might see just a big dollar amount in terms of the fine, and especially a couple of the big financial financial institution enforcement actions. But I think what sets apart maybe the top three, and that I think resonates with us, is there's almost a tagline or a simple takeaway that you can, or a lesson that you can tie to each of these top three, right? With number one, CSE being about US dollar transactions even for non-US entities. Number two, ExxonMobil being any kind of dealings with SDNs, even if you're not sort of directly with Igor Sechin and the whole issue there in terms of receipt of services and the dispute there and the lawsuit, and we can attest to the fact that those two things have very fundamentally changed the way that people think through and sort of process compliance risk when it comes to those types of things. And then the third with ELF being supply chain risk and having to understand more than just what's going on with your direct supplier. Perhaps it's sort of layers beyond that. And I think that is now absolutely blown up when you look at everything that's going on with Xinjiang and sort of the sourcing issues and the sanctions issues that come out of supplying out of that region. And it's the same concept that ELF is talking about, and it's really just exploded. So I think those three things and the big sort of takeaways there, that those really resonated and continue to resonate, which I think is why you saw them just kind of come up time and again across the board.
Yeah, I mean, the couple things I'd add on those are one, with respect to ELF in particular. I mean, I thought that the impact of that, I could see that it was huge just from my own practice and from our firm's practice, because we just started getting a lot of questions about how to incorporate potential sanctions issues into supply chain audits, because I think those audits are relatively frequent, but they didn't really incorporate a sanctions component into it until ELF, and I think it's fairly standard practice now, only 2 years later. And so that was a case that I felt like I knew it had an effect. I'd be curious with respect to CSE to see whether or not companies changed their behavior with respect to the use of dollars after that came out. Because I think, if you went to OFAC conferences before CSE and even after CSE, you hear them say the mere fact that there's a use of dollars does not create a U.S. nexus. But really after CSE, that strikes me as almost false, because they went so far in that enforcement action to come up with a U.S. nexus because of the use of dollars that it's really hard to think of it would be hard from a lawyer's perspective to tell a client, yes, you're using dollars, but because the bank that you're dealing with is outside the U.S. and has its own dollar reserves, that is not a U.S. nexus for sanctions purposes. After CSE, I don't think you could be very comfortable giving that advice, even though you can go to an OFAC conference and hear people from OFAC tell you that. It just doesn't. It's more complicated and in a bad way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the other thing, I don't know, Michael, if this struck you, but one thing too with the three that we're talking about, the top three, these are not big monetary penalties, right? They're relatively modest in the grand scheme of things. Obviously we see there's some on the list that are 9 figures, and these are certainly not. ELF is less than $1 million US, and still, it's sort of the lessons learned are very impactful, and I think I wonder if that was kind of echoed in what you heard from folks, just about it's not necessarily about the bottom line, it's about sort of that what the secondary and tertiary consequences of these takeaways are.
Yeah, definitely, and as you say, you can see that in the enforcement actions, but you can also see it in the fact that the ExxonMobil fine was overturned.
Right.
So it's which is a fascinating insight as well, is that perhaps in the OFAC world, which might seem weird to other legal spheres, is that even though a fine that is no longer active or has been removed, the compliance lessons endure, which is kind of interesting. But definitely, I mean, some of these cases are really quite small. I mean, I think the BitGo and BitPay ones, the cryptocurrency ones, which are sort of significant for obvious reasons, are incredibly small dollar amounts. On the sort of flip side of that argument, I found it quite interesting. The big bank cases are very well established, and we've had, BNP Paribas was 2014, so they're quite. OFAC has done them a lot, and I was quite surprised to see that Standard Chartered and UniCredit got a few votes as well. It seems as though particularly the points around searching for SDNs or searching for sanctioned parties by IP addresses and IP address screenings was something that came up in those settlements, that even people that do the big bank, that represent banks and should be well versed in what these cases look like, still found those settlements quite interesting, which I thought was sort of noteworthy as well.
Yeah, I think hitting on the point you just made, which is the IP addresses and sort of location information that might be within the base of knowledge of the screening party, whether it's a bank or anybody else. I think that is a little bit of an evolution in terms of the sort of lessons learned that are coming across, right? Because the older bank cases, I think the party's location and some of the information that was known to the banks was through more traditional means, perhaps. And I think the idea that parties are now going to be held to account if within their base of knowledge, if within their documentation, their files, their records are these types of bits of information, is significant. And I think that is sort of a slight expansion. I think you're right, though, that as a general matter, those cases are, they're not all that dissimilar to the things that we've seen over the course of the past decade and sort of the big, large transaction volume bank cases.
Yeah, I mean so I think it's both surprising that there were no banks in the top three, given the fact that OFAC's main focus is on
the financial
restrictions and the financial sector. But I think it's also surprising, as you point out, Michael, that there were some bank cases that were close to the top three, because the bank cases have been going on for so long, and they seem like almost a product from a different era, in the sense that the lessons learned from most of the bank cases is if your management committee and your chief executives decide that they'd rather try and make money and evade sanctions by changing financial documents in order to remove the mention of sanctions, that can get you in a lot of trouble. Like that's
pretty well established now.
Well, that's pretty well established now, and I think at the time it was just a question of nobody really believed that OFAC was going to reach out in the ways that it ultimately did with respect to the banks. But now I think everybody knows that could happen, and certainly in the banks that it's a different era. But I agree with you that there's some interesting points from some of the new cases with respect to IP addresses, which is not just a bank issue. It's coming up in like the SAP enforcement action from last year, which was a multi-agency enforcement action, and I think it's in your BIS survey, also had some of that going.
Yeah, I think SAP is actually, that's a good segue. I think SAP is actually the only one that's on both lists, and it's on the OFAC and the BIS list, and of course, it's also a DOJ matter at the end of the day, and there was a DOJ resolution as part of that as well. So maybe let's pivot to the BIS list. Anything, and I know you said at the outset, Michael, that there was a slightly lower response rate on the BIS front, which is not terribly surprising, because I think on the OFAC side, there's just more, certainly in DC, I think we can attest to this, there's sort of more attention paid on kind of a broad basis, and probably just more folks that are kind of paying attention to that on a daily basis. But on the BIS side, anything particularly surprising there? I mean, ZTE, I think, was the obvious number one. Not surprising that's what kind of came out on top of the survey, but anything else sort of surprising, even in the comments you got, or anything else on the BIS side?
Yeah, I mean, the ZTE matter, the scope of the sort of significance of the ZTE matter is what we've proved with the BIS survey. I mean, it was the runaway winner by a long way. The SAP settlement also did poll quite well in the BIS section. But as you've referred to, the sort of DOJ angle of that and the first under the revamped voluntary disclosure program was probably why it was significant, less so on the BIS side, I suspect. Apart from that, really, it was sort of ZTE and then daylight was the result, was the sort of takeaway from it. What I thought was interesting is I thought the Nordic Maritime case, which was reviewed by the Undersecretary and then upheld, was going to poll better than it did, but apparently not. That only registered 2 votes as opposed to ZTE's 19. In terms of takeaways, I suppose the most interesting thing was the general. There's less meat on the bone with BIS cases, it seems. And that's what was reflected in the results, where there was a lot you could read into both the ZTE and SAP cases. And while I haven't actually checked this, but in terms of what cases BIS has put out press releases about, I could say in the last 5 years that these two would be 2 of the very few cases that they've done that for. So I suppose what this really speaks to is that OFAC's enforcement stance seems to be, look, here's a lesson we could teach you while penalising this company. Whereas BIS is sort of, here's a violation, let's penalise the violation, and we'll upload the penalty order to a dusty back corner of our website, and if anyone wants to find it, they can.
Yeah,
so, yes.
A very good point. Very good point. Sorry, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I do think that it's, at least looking from the outside, it seems to be the likely result of a difference in policy between BIS and OFAC. At least from the outside looking in, it looks to me like OFAC, as you said, Michael, is really trying to use its enforcement actions to teach broader lessons. And as a result, people are paying a lot of attention to them because the fact that CSE got penalized $11 million, I mean, I don't think that really, unless CSE is your client, I don't think you really care. But the fact that OFAC is now, looking at dollar transactions, even though they didn't directly clear in New York, and treating that as a U.S. nexus that gives them the jurisdiction to penalize, is something that we all need to tell our clients. And when OFAC, wraps it up into a little package and tells you what the lesson is, you got to start paying attention so you can advise your clients properly. BIS, for whatever reason, has not really decided to do that with its enforcement actions. They're harder to find, just from a website perspective, and they don't necessarily put out a press release, and they certainly don't send an immediate email a lot of the time when they do one, and they don't package it up in a little message. And so it's not totally surprising to me that people are paying less attention to BIS enforcement actions, because they don't seem to be going out of their way to try and teach lessons beyond, like, this party got hit with an $11 million fine or whatever.
Yeah, I think a couple other comments to that point, and I agree completely with Michael's insight that in the dusty little corner of the website comment, not to disparage our friends at BIS, who we know are doing great work, but I think there's a couple things going on here in my view. So it is kind of a marketing and publicity issue to some degree. I think OFAC kind of has this down to a science now to some degree, and has a very clean, easy to navigate website. They have their sort of the push notifications and emails that go out whenever any enforcement actions come out, anybody gets out of the SDN list, et cetera. And it's very easy to kind of stay on top of all that. I think on the BIS side as well, and this is borne out in part by, I think, if we look at ZTE and SAP, those are multi-agency actions both, and in both cases were really led in the first instance by DOJ. In ZTE, of course, there was the resolution with DOJ that came a year before the denial order, and then the second fine and the second monitor and everything else with ZTE. So I was still at DOJ when this was going on, so I was living through this, but this is not to be forgotten there. And then in SAP the same with the 3 agencies, but with DOJ kind of, I would say, probably having the lead on that in many respects. And so there is a lot of instances on the traditional export control side, violations of the EAR side, where it does probably verge into or overlap a little bit more with the criminal jurisdiction of DOJ. And so you're going to see probably more kind of DOJ-led efforts there and BIS kind of working in tandem or even coming as a more secondary role on some of those. And so DOJ has no problem kind of promoting and touting what it's doing when it goes that route. But if it does shift into a pure administrative enforcement action on its own, yeah, that seems to be a little bit of a gap. It just seems to be an area that BIS does not sort of run screaming from the rooftops about when they are putting something out to try to teach a lesson, to try to engender certain compliance takeaways the way that OFAC does. So I agree completely, and that I think is a little bit of a quirk of kind of where they sit and how they team up with other agencies, and the fact that we just see OFAC acting independently more often, I think, than BIS. But that's I totally agree on that.
Yeah, I mean the one thing that I would add from that is that because of the differences in the way the agencies proceed, I mean, you have to kind of try and figure out from the BIS matters, well, what is the lesson learned? And I mean, sometimes that's hard and sometimes that's not. I mean, but take ZTE. I mean, to me, ZTE is a BIS case in this respect. I mean, it really was a DOJ enforcement action. I mean, BIS had jurisdiction because there were some U.S. goods that were being transshipped to Iran as part of the predicate. But to me, the lesson learned from ZTE is that in a multi-jurisdiction or multi-agency enforcement action, the BIS entity list can be used as a tool to get parties to the table and change their behavior, and it's a more subtle tool than the SDN list. So ZTE was essentially part of that enforcement action, and I think from the outside it looked like they were having a tough time getting ZTE to take it seriously, and ultimately the entity list was used as a way to kind of get ZTE to the table and accede to U.S. jurisdiction, and that was later used with Huawei as well, although it hasn't worked in the same way that it was with Huawei. But so that's to me, that's part of the trick with BIS is you've got to figure out for yourself what the lesson is as opposed to it being spoon-fed.
Yeah, one other comment on that, and then I'll throw it back to Michael, is, to Tim's point, I agree with that, and I can attest to the fact that was, in fact, what was going on kind of behind the scenes in terms of the entity listing to kind of bring ZTE to the table. That also represents in some ways, now that all the DOJ resolution and the initial resolution with ZTE was early 2017, so it was that was largely underway in the tail end of the Obama administration, then kind of the Trump administration took it over. That's to me sort of represents a bit of the old approach to how to use the entity list, which is to change behavior, as opposed to the Trump administration approach, which was purely punitive in many respects and was not really meant to change behavior. It was meant to isolate companies, especially Chinese companies, and just try to, punish them essentially. And I think it remains to be seen what the Biden administration is going to do there, if it's going to pivot back a little bit to the old approach or if it's going to use a bit of a hybrid. I think some of what we're seeing so far suggests that they're going to use a bit of a hybrid approach there, but I think that is also part of why ZTE is so fascinating. It's kind of that bridge in the timing, because it was all unraveling in 2017 and 18, and that was a very important transition period, obviously.
So, Michael, which actions would you have picked from OFAC and BIS? Assuming you didn't already give yourself a vote.
Yeah,
I'm curious as to
the integrity is the integrity of the vote in question here? Do we need to check?
I believe I referenced in the article sanctions experts, and I would not dare call myself that. So no, I am not. I was not counted in it. Well, from the OFAC side, as I said, ELF Cosmetics I thought would do quite well. I thought the CETA case from 2020 would do okay, only because the US jurisdiction in that case was sort of odd, in that it was email or messages sent through servers in Texas or somewhere like that, in Atlanta, I think it might have been. So I thought that would do quite well. And then I thought the Haverly Systems case might do quite well because of the credit extension issue. But perhaps it wasn't because of the Russian sectoral sanctions issue that they fell. It was because they had the misstatements they had made, or the sort of how they dealt with trying to get around that was the problem, rather than it being a sort of a hard enforcement of that. of that regulation. So those were my picks that all proved to be incorrect apart from one. So there you go. Long way off.
Those are but those are three good picks. I mean, I do think that the CETA enforcement action is overlooked in some sense because the discussion there was so technical, but any enforcement action that really extends the OFAC's jurisdiction is important because, as we see from the outside and with clients, that's usually question number one is there U.S. nexus? Because if there is, the rules are so different than if there is no U.S. nexus, and the enforcement risk is so different. And so any enforcement action that changes, that moves the ball or changes the bar that for a U.S. nexus, and especially one that makes it lower. And in CETA, you're exactly right. I mean, it was kind of a random connection to the U.S. that got CETA into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and I think on that point as well, obviously with OFAC, everybody's following the money always, right? You're always worried about where the dollar flows are, where's the money, where's the correspondent accounts, are we touching the U.S. that way? I think that highlights, to Tim's point, when there are sort of the harder to pin down intangible connections because there are servers in the U.S. or there are services being rendered from the U.S. The SAP action has a little bit of this to it as well as part of, I think, why it resonated with people. When you're talking about software and services, cloud-based services, those are things that are not necessarily top of mind when you're thinking through kind of OFAC compliance issues, and so those are I think valuable takeaways and sort of talking points to keep in mind when you think about those items as well.
I might do the most overlooked case on the list and write an op-ed about the CETA enforcement action.
Oh, that'd be there you go. Or the follow-up could be the correct answer to my question was these three cases.
Exactly.
Sorry, everybody else got it wrong.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, yeah, I was thinking the next one might be the DDTC survey, but I think we're a fair way off. We need a few more cases, I think, from them.
I was going to say, you'd have to do a 10-year period.
Yeah, I think in the last decade we were barely at 20 consent agreements. So yeah, you don't have a ton of data points to look at on DDTC side, but
I think from a journalism perspective, unless DDTC gets the treatment that other agencies get, which is it's the small, the smallest office in the US government, the small but powerful office in the US government that no one's ever heard about, which I think OFAC got a few years ago, then BIS during the Trump administration, and the FARA unit.
Yes, CFIUS has got that as well. But yeah, I don't know if anybody wrote that article about DDTC. I don't think I've seen it. But not to overlook our friends at DDTC, of course. All right, well, Michael, we really appreciate you joining us. Again, to everybody out there, recommend that you, if you're not already getting Just Sanctions, you need to get Just Sanctions, and certainly look for Michael's pieces that ran in August in GIR, Just Sanctions. And thank you, Michael, for joining us, and we'll see you next time around. Thanks.
Yeah, great stuff, Michael. Thanks for the article.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you to Michael Griffiths from GIR for joining us. That was a lot of fun, and a nice, again, sort of a nice end of summer palate cleanser to talk about one of our favorite topics, enforcement actions. And
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to what comes out next on this. I mean, I think we've given him some ideas for some follow-ups,
and also, honestly, probably a good and useful exercise to do every couple years.
Agreed.
To look back and let everybody reflect on what is it that I spent all my time talking about and thinking about. It's these few matters. So yeah, that was good. Okay, so with that, as I said at the outset, we only have two topics. We might actually get in under an hour today, unless Tim and I really go off overboard here. But the only other topic we really wanted to cover today is in some ways is I think the number one topic. At least in the U.S. right now, internationally, if not globally, and that's the situation in Afghanistan. And so, obviously, we're assuming all of you out there are following what's happened with the U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban reclaiming control, and of course, just a few days ago, the deadly bombing outside the airport in Kabul. So things have gone from sort of bad to worse quite quickly in Afghanistan, and it's become very messy in many, many ways. And we're not at all making light of the situation. In fact, we're going to spend, I think, probably a decent amount of time talking about the sort of perhaps the bubbling humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan that's about to hit if it's not already in full swing. But to shift focus for a moment to think about what it means now that the Taliban has claimed control of government in Afghanistan. The Taliban, of course, is a specially designated global terrorist group, has been so designated for many, many, many years, dating back to just after 9/11. And so, there are complications there, and Tim and I have fielded our fair share of questions in the early days and weeks of this situation, with respect to companies and individuals who are trying to do their best to wind down things and get out of Afghanistan safely, and what that means in terms of dealings with the Taliban. So that's kind of one aspect of this. But I think the more interesting question, quite frankly, is what comes next. And obviously, we are just now at the end of the U.S. Withdrawal. It is August 31st. This is it. This is the end, literally today. And so, what comes next, I think, is the real question. And I think, and I'll just throw this to Tim, but I think that, and obviously there's kind of two big competing interests here in my view. One is, what is the proper way to treat Afghanistan and a government that's controlled by the Taliban? Are we as the United States, from a sanctions policy matter, are we going to take a full comprehensive approach? We're going to treat them like North Korea or Iran? Are we going to do something in the middle that's perhaps just blocking the government, the Taliban, certain other aspects, perhaps something akin to what we've done in Venezuela? Or is it going to be more like what's just happened in Myanmar and Burma earlier this year, where maybe we don't even do that? There's an executive order that comes out. There are many different swaths, perhaps, of the economy and affiliates of the Taliban that get sanctioned. And then the flip side of that, of course, is what happens with all of the aid that has been flowing to Afghanistan for many, many years, which is really the linchpin of their economy. They rely so heavily on international aid and U.S. aid, and now the news came out weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago, that the U.S. was going to freeze all of the U.S.-based assets of the Afghan central bank, so that the Taliban could not get a hold of those assets. That's billions of dollars. There's more in that regard as well. IMF, World Bank, others are acting in a similar vein. So, how does the U.S. respond, and how does the global community respond from a sanctions imposition standpoint on the one hand, with regard to a group that is now controlling the government there, that is, I think, in everybody's view, this is a malign actor of the highest order, and somebody that is not going to be, it's going to be very difficult to be able to treat them as a sort of typical kind of head of state or ruling party of a state. And then on the other hand, what happens to the Afghan people and all of the humanitarian aid that I think everybody agrees we would like to see continue to flow, or to flow in the future to Afghanistan. So what are we looking into your crystal ball, Tim? What do you think happens next, or what are your initial thoughts on sort of where the U.S. goes from here?
So it is a tricky problem, because when you put a group like the Taliban on the SDGT list, there are not a lot of exceptions to that list, because essentially, when you're a designated global terrorist, the rule is nobody from the U.S. and with U.S. connections or U.S. nexus transactions should be dealing with you, and end of story. But when a group like that comes into the government, somewhat like when Hamas took over the Palestinian territories after they won the election in 2006, it becomes much harder, because one central tenet of sanctions policy is, no matter how much we hate the government and don't want to deal with the government of a country, we do want to make sure that there is a route for humanitarian trade. And so usually there are various exceptions that allow dealings with governments, even ones like North Korea or ones like Iran that are, we view as malign actors. There's exceptions for humanitarian policy, and there's kind of a very complex system that's put into place as to what transactions will be allowed and what transactions won't. It's not like the simple kind of binary system that you have normally with a designated terrorist group where it's like no transactions. That's the general rule. Now that the Taliban has taken over, I think from a practical perspective, that can't be the rule. And we saw this in some of the questions that we were getting, like, could you deal with the Taliban as you were being evacuated from Afghanistan? If you had to pay certain payments that were normal payments at the airport that you would pay to the government, could those payments be made to the Taliban? Would that be a sanctions violation? Like, I think from a policy perspective, OFAC, I would hope, would tell you, of course you can make those payments to get out of the country and save your life. On the other hand, from a purely like legal perspective, it was very hard to come up with a rationale for why those sorts of payments would be allowed, because there aren't any general licenses or exceptions that would allow those sorts of payments to be made. And so I think that's the sort of very practical and important issue that is going to come up a lot. And I think there are some very smart people over at OFAC and in the Treasury Department trying to figure out what to do about this, because it is a kind of a thorny problem. You don't want to increase the ability of the Taliban to have resources, which is why we saw the U.S. government freeze the Afghan government's, the Taliban's access to various resources that are within U.S. jurisdiction once the Taliban took over the government. On the other hand, it's the government now, and so to deal with the Afghan people and to provide humanitarian aid and to engage in transactions for the protection of human life, you're going to probably have to, as a practical matter, deal with the government in some way, and sanctions policy needs to reflect that. So I think that's what they're working on now. How fast they're going.
I think there's just sort of a lot of moving parts that are all tied up within that. One is, as I alluded to, sort of we're assuming there's going to be a program that is stood up essentially that is targeting Afghanistan. And so that most likely will come in the form of an executive order as the sort of first move there. But we don't know. There could be something else. There could be an act by Congress. There could be something else. But let's assume probably an EO that comes out. What is that going to look like? How broadly is it going to sweep? How is it going to define the government of Afghanistan? How is it going to define the Taliban? The Taliban's been in SDGT for 2 decades, but who's part of that and who's not part of that? There are many other kind of Taliban affiliates that are also SDGTs, and so that's kind of a tricky question. Another related question is whether or not the Taliban gets designated as a foreign terrorist organization or state sponsor of terror, because as we just saw play out at the end of the Trump administration with the Houthis in Yemen, that has big consequences, and that might mean if you deem them to be an FTO or state sponsor of terror, then that, I think, significantly decreases the ability to sort of negotiate with them as a head of state, essentially, or as a ruling party in Afghanistan. And obviously in the Yemen situation, that was quickly undone by the Biden administration, but that I think is a good recent illustration of where we kind of had a similar situation like that. And so how that gets handled is another question, because there are plenty of people that are in the U.S. that are calling for them to be treated as an FTO and a state sponsor of terror. And so that's another thing that has to be worked out. And so, it's kind of, from the recent examples we have obviously Burma is very recent. And how the Biden administration has dealt with the Burma situation and the military in Burma, that to me kind of seems like the most instructive, which suggests to me that they're not going to go kind of all in on certainly on any kind of maximum pressure type program at the start. It's going to be something that's a little more targeted, and what that exactly looks like is hard to say, but that's kind of my thought on that. I don't know what your feeling is there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're exactly right when you talk about the need to really update what's going on with the Taliban, because until the last few weeks, the idea that anybody would need from, certainly with a U.S. nexus to engage in transactions with the Taliban, it just wasn't realistic. Like, that wasn't something that was, when the designation was made, and really in the 20 years since, there hasn't been a lot of legitimate need to do transactions with the Taliban. But at this point, I mean, now that they run the government in Afghanistan, you can think of lots of transactions that the U.S. Would and should support that would need to go through the Taliban, or potentially need to go through the Taliban. And so they do need to figure out kind of what do we want to do in terms of a designation? What types of general licenses do we want to have? Is it smart to turn them into a foreign terrorist organization? From just a practical perspective of, it would make it that much harder for humanitarian aid to get through to Afghanistan, which is what I think was driving the situation in Yemen, which I think is a great example of, the practical reality was that the Trump administration wanted to just signal to the Houthis that there was, that they were disapproving of the behavior, but the Biden administration came in and said, but yeah, this creates all sorts of practical problems, and we're going to go a different direction. I think that may be kind of the outlook here. Is the Taliban designation, when it came down, I think was much more of a symbolic designation. I mean, this was the group that had, after all, was at least connected and facilitated 9/11. And so, the biggest terrorist act in the history of the country, and this group is at least somewhat involved, you've got to designate them as a terrorist organization and a global terrorist organization. 20 years later, I mean, what is the Taliban's connection to terrorism at this point? I'm not saying that it's different, but it may be, and things change in 20 years. And, the Taliban, I think, probably is not anxious to have a repeat of 2001, even though they ultimately were able to come back into power. It was a long road, and they may do things differently.
Right, and also, if the original designation was meant to sort of cut them off from the global financial system, essentially, that by most accounts seems to have been successful, but now they're just postured in a totally different way as again, as a sort of head of government, and with access to more resources, with access to different streams of revenue, with access to, just sort of, there are just many different sort of vectors that now intersect with the Taliban that were just not there, 2 months ago. And so, and to your point on the humanitarian aid, I think this is the thing that everybody is really wringing their hands about and pulling their hair out about, which is how will it, and again, to the point, and I've seen some numbers that suggest, again, that, Afghanistan does not have a terribly sophisticated economy. They are heavily reliant on international aid, and they have been heavily reliant on U.S. aid for many years. Now, pulling the plug on all of that overnight is going to be just a catastrophe for, every, sort of the population, the run of, the everyday population in Afghanistan. And so what is there that by the way that the U.S. sets up its sanctions program, whatever that is going to be, how that is done, and how it looks at and authorizes and facilitates humanitarian transactions is a big, huge open question. And whether it's going to go with a system of just, broad GLs like we've seen in other places, like in Venezuela and things of that sort, is that what we're going to get, or is there going to be something else? Obviously, we've talked about this a lot, especially during the COVID crisis. In some of these more heavily sanctioned countries, and presumably Afghanistan is about to be one of them again, it's just very difficult to get humanitarian assistance of any kind, whether it's food, medicine, medical equipment, etc., into the country and get it to the right people, right? It's just, there's always the fear, of course, that it's going to just be it's going to be pilfered left and right by the ruling party. And how do you do that? How do you allow NGOs and other organizations to operate safely and to be able to partner with global financial institutions and other companies to be able to get these supplies and these goods and this aid to the people who really need it on the ground? And that is, I think, a huge open question as to how that's going to work, because quite frankly, as we have seen and we have experienced, and anyone else who deals in this area has experienced, to date, OFAC hasn't found a perfect way to do it, and there is just no way to do it to sort of properly incentivize, or there has been to date no way to really do it to kind of properly incentivize people to engage in humanitarian trade without fear of running afoul of U.S. sanctions. There just isn't, and particularly, I mean, a lot of that is driven by the banks, obviously, as we know, but it flows. It's sort of broader than that. And so, what happens here? Do they try something new? Do they go back to the playbook and try what they've done before? I don't know. And I think that's a really interesting question, and perhaps this could be a watershed moment and a bit of a test case to see how they choose to do it, because they're basically going to start from scratch and figure out how to do it. And here,
Well,
it's needed more than
the one thing that I would add to that is, I mean, it would be better if they were starting from scratch,
right,
because I think your model of Burma is the right one. That is, you have a sanctions program that is harsh on the actors that you're worried about, but because it's not a embargo or countrywide sanctions program, you at least give a much better chance to humanitarian forms of aid, because while the banks are reluctant to do business in any heavily sanctioned jurisdiction, including Burma, at least when it's not an embargo, there is a pretty easy way to navigate that by screening for sanctioned parties, and you know who those sanctioned parties are. I mean, the problem that the administration has, in my view, is that if it wants to set up a Burma-like system, it's going to need to remove the Taliban from the SDGT list. And I just find it very hard to imagine that in this
not going to
climate
happen.
that's going to
There's
happen.
no way that's going to happen.
Which means then you've got to do it with general licenses,
Right.
because it's just going to be really hard to figure out a way in which there's a transaction in which the government is involved but the Taliban
Right.
is
I
not.
should also add that Tim's last comment has hit on what is a fundamental issue here, which is this is essentially a problem of the U.S. is making. The whole thing, right? I mean, I'm not blaming the current administration. This goes way back, obviously, but this is 20 years of U.S. policy, and now having the needle being put in the balloon, and now this is everybody has to deal with what the consequences are. And so I think that in particular puts a huge strain from a perception and a standpoint with the current administration as to be sort of very, they are constrained in some ways, I think, by that. I think as opposed to being kind of free in many other respects, as we've talked about, they have been free to kind of course correct from things that the Trump administration did. And, that's a pretty easy narrative, a pretty easy kind of headline to weave there. This is much trickier, much trickier, because at the end of the day, even though this is 20 plus years of U.S. policy coming to a crashing conclusion, the ultimate decision here was on President Biden, and this is what we're dealing with. So that also just muddies the water considerably, and we'll have to see how that plays out and how Congress reacts and all the rest of it. But this is one of the more fascinating areas. We talk about a lot of interesting issues that kind of percolate out of foreign policy as it relates to sanctions. This is really one of the more fascinating areas and challenges, quite frankly, that the administration, that I could imagine this or any administration having to face in terms of how to pivot away from this current situation, the U.S. withdrawal, the Taliban taking back over, and what to do next.
Right, and without making what is likely a terrible humanitarian crisis worse, while at the same time trying not to reward the Taliban, right. And nothing that I think either of us has said here should make people think that we don't think the Taliban is capable of engaging in terrible behavior, particularly domestically within Afghanistan, maybe outside of Afghanistan. I just don't claim to have any expertise on that. But the fact is that somebody needs to figure out kind of what our policy is with respect to the Taliban, and then, unfortunately, not from a blank slate, figure out how to accomplish what that policy.
The last thing that I will add here to further spice things up is, of course, with the U.S. leaving, that creates a vacuum that now China and Russia are likely salivating to try to fill with respect to Afghanistan.
Yep.
And with respect to dealings with the Taliban and or the government and opportunities there. And that is also just another X factor here as to how the U.S. manages that, because that is going to be obviously a lot of history with these countries in Afghanistan, and how that plays out is going to be just absolutely fascinating. And it's very unclear kind of how the next phases and any U.S. actions are going to potentially play right into the hands of those two key adversaries of the U.S.
Well, it's been, I haven't followed the Russia-Afghanistan relationship very closely, but China I'm more familiar with, and it's been very interesting in the sense that, at 9/11, I think that if there was a bigger adversary to the Taliban in the world in the U.S., it was China. I mean, they had a very antagonistic relationship. My understanding is that over the past 20 years, the Taliban, as it's been out of power, has tried to work to correct that and improve its relationship with the Chinese government. And at least as I understand it, they've reached an accommodation that is a lot less unfriendly than it was in the past. And as you point out, Brian, I mean, it certainly could be an avenue for China to build on that, and for the Taliban to build on that. I mean, it is they share a border, so the Taliban has strong incentives not to antagonize China.
Right. So I think that's a good place to end. And look, obviously, this is a monumental story, and sanctions is only a small part of it, but we will be keeping a close watch on this, as we expect there's going to be a lot of activity in the coming month or two here. And obviously, just the latest, unfortunately, in a series of really heart-wrenching kind of stories that sort of lead us to discuss these issues on the pod. But let's end there. And like we said, we have plenty to catch up on next time that we have not even mentioned this week. But thank you again to Michael Griffiths from GIR for joining us for a very fun conversation, and then a little bit more of a somber conversation in the second half of the pod today, talking about Afghanistan and what's coming next. But to everybody out there, hope everyone is in the U.S. Hope you have an enjoyable Labor Day weekend. Wear your masks, get your shots, and we will see you in a couple weeks for the next episode. Until then, stay safe and stay sanctions free.
See you in September. Stay sanctions free.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.